Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Bradford seminar. I'm David Wilcove, and I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker. Our speaker today is David Williams. David is a lecturer in sustainability and the environment at the University of Leeds. He's a conservation scientist with a particular interest in studying how different land use practices affect biodiversity, with a special focus on agriculture, which has for many years been the major threat to biodiversity globally. David was trained as an ecologist at Cambridge, but his work increasingly combines the natural sciences with the social sciences. And I would say overall that one of the characteristics of David's work is that he likes to go a step or two deeper than most conservation scientists. So, for example, where many scientists might be content to document the impact of a particular crop on biodiversity, say how oil palm in Southeast Asia affects wildlife, David likes to go a step further and ask, what drives the demand for that crop in the first place? His reasoning being, correctly I think, that unless you know the drivers, you can't really address the problem in the long term. And indeed, David is looking for solutions to the problems facing biodiversity, not merely cataloging the long list of woes facing biodiversity today. Now, if the year 2020 was in most respects a pretty awful year for everyone, I have to say for me, one of the real bright spots during the first half of the year was the chance to work with David and with his former thesis advisor, Andrew Balmford, on a paper exploring the degree to which conservation scientists actually look for and test solutions to the problems facing biodiversity. I very much enjoyed the chance to work with David, and it is a particular pleasure to welcome him to Princeton for this virtual visit. So with that, let me welcome today's seminar speaker, David Williams.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that that very generous introduction. And yeah, thanks a lot to well, for everyone for attending and for having me here. It's a real pleasure, and it's a real honor actually to be here as well. So being British, I thought it was important to start off with an apology. This title, The Role of Science in Conserving Biodiversity and Feeding the World, it seemed a lot less pretentious when I wrote it down on an email a few months ago. But it does more or less capture what I want to talk about today. So as David said, I'm a conservation scientist. I'm interested in conserving biodiversity, and in particular, whilst improving food security for people across the world. Now, this bit about the role of science, this sort of touches on some of what David was talking about. Again, I'm really interested in making sure that as conservation scientists, as academics, as researchers, we're asking the questions that can really have the biggest impact. And so I'm hoping that I can try and draw out some sort of broader themes on this. So what kinds of questions should we be asking? So obviously, this is a hugely collaborative effort, what I'll be talking about today. I've been lucky enough over the past few years to work with a wide range of really fantastic collaborators, and I just wanted to acknowledge them and thank them very much for all of their help. Okay, so I'm a conservation scientist. This basically means that I think biodiversity is great. I watched too much David Attenborough when I was young. I think you have that in the States, right? And I just think it's one of the most remarkable and one of the most inspiring aspects of the world that we live in. And I want there to be biodiversity, not just for me in my increasing old age, but for future generations as well, right? I've got a little niece, I've got a little nephew. I want the biodiversity that I can enjoy to be there for them in the future. Unfortunately, however, biodiversity is not doing particularly well at a global level. So this is a pretty monstrous figure, actually, from a paper that David Leclerc and colleagues put out last year. Don't worry about anything to the right of that dashed line. Those are future projections under different scenarios. What we're interested in is the historical change in biodiversity up until the year 2010. So they looked at a series of different metrics. So the amount of suitable habitat, the density of wild populations, the degree to which biological communities are intact or not, and maybe most fundamentally, the degree to which species have gone extinct or not at a regional or global level. And across all of these different metrics, you could basically, like, the take-home message here is that everything is declining, right? All of these lines are trending downwards. So this is pretty bad news for those of us who are concerned about biodiversity. But actually, things are quite a lot worse than they may appear. These are global patterns, but if we look at the most biodiverse regions of the world, the tropics, declines are even greater there. So a few years ago, we looked at the database of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN. And we looked at the proportion of species that were threatened, listed as threatened with extinction in each of these three high biodiversity tropical regions: South and Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and tropical South America. And I'm just showing data for mammals because we've got really good data for them. And you can see that levels of threat are really very high indeed. Around 60% of large mammals in South and Southeast Asia and tropical South America are threatened with extinction, way above the roughly 20% of the global average. Sub-Saharan Africa seems to be doing a bit better, but as I'm going to talk about later, it's not clear that this is going to remain the case for much longer. So this is really worrying for those of us who love biodiversity and want to conserve it, but it's also going to have very serious impacts for human well-being. And you don't have to take my word for this. I mean, I've already told you I've got a vested interest in conserving it. You can actually go to the kind of the hard-nosed uber capitalists of the World Economic Forum. So last year, about a year ago, actually, they gathered in Davos in southern Switzerland, and they came up with their global risks landscape for the coming year. And they put biodiversity loss as both one of the most likely and one of the most impactful of global risks. And I think it's worth pointing out, considering where they were in the world and when they were doing this, that they actually ranked infectious diseases as both less likely and less impactful than biodiversity loss. So this is really, really pretty serious for human well-being. Now, as a conservation scientist, I think we've got two really important jobs. Firstly, we need to understand why biodiversity is declining. And secondly, we need to understand what we can do about it. And I actually think it's worthwhile unpacking both of these questions. So let's look first at threats to biodiversity. So as that Leclerc paper, and as a lot of you will know, biodiversity is declining across the world. That is its state in many parts of the world. And the first step is to work out what the direct cause of this change in state is. What is the threatening mechanism that's causing this change? For example, habitat loss is a common one. But I think we actually have to go a little bit further than that, because habitat loss doesn't just happen for no reason. It happens because there's some kind of source for this mechanism. For example, demand for agricultural land. And indeed, even this doesn't really tell us everything we need to know, because there is going to be some kind of underlying driver that kicks off this causal chain. And I think we really need to understand this whole range of threats, this whole causal chain, if we're really going to get into why biodiversity is declining. And this is really difficult. It's difficult for a number of reasons. Firstly, just drawing these causal links can be really hard. Secondly, the spatial scale at which we need to work increases as we move from the state of biodiversity up to the driver of change. You might be able to understand what's happening in a single habitat patch at that scale, but to understand why increasing consumption is increasing the loss of that habitat is going to require taking a step back to a regional or even a global level. Secondly, human factors become more and more important as we work up this spatial scale. So again, you can understand a declining population or the impact of habitat loss using those skills that a lot of us have as natural scientists, ecology, population biology, and things like that. But these are pretty much completely useless if we're trying to understand how increased consumption might lead to a demand for agricultural land. We need to bring in economics and demographics and psychology and cultural studies and social sciences and a whole range of different disciplines. And this is really hard to do. And I think it's these difficulties which mean that conservation science basically doesn't do it. So this is the paper that David was talking about. We looked at how roughly 1,000 conservation papers over the last 20 years, we looked at what kinds of questions they asked. And we found that the vast majority of them either just described the state of nature or they described that mechanism of change, that direct threat. Very, very few kind of dug down into what was ultimately driving changes. So that's understanding threats. How about trying to find solutions? Well, again, I think it's worthwhile unpacking what we mean by this, because solutions don't just appear fully formed. Rather, we need to propose them, we then need to design them, implement them, and finally we need to test them. And preferably, we need to do this again across the whole range of the causal chain. But again, conservation science doesn't really seem to be doing this. Those same 1,000-odd papers, we found that the majority in every year don't even propose a response to the change in biodiversity that they're discussing. There was a bit of an increase in the number of studies testing responses, which is good news. But I think it's worthwhile pointing out that most of these were looking at the effects of protected areas on habitat conversion. Undoubtedly a very important response to investigate, but it does mean that the vast majority of conservation work, we're not really investigating using conservation science. Very few studies designed or implemented responses. Okay, so conservation science doesn't seem to be doing a great job maybe of focusing on the whole range of things we need it to. But what do we do? What do we know? What do we know about what is driving biodiversity declines? Well, we go back to the IUCN database on threatened species, and here we've looked at the mechanisms and the sources behind that are threatening different species. And what we find is that these blue bars, habitat loss, seem to be the most important. More species are threatened by habitat loss than they are by direct mortality. And in particular, habitat loss driven by the global food system threatens more species than anything else. So agricultural expansion threatens more species than any other factor at the moment. And not only that, agriculture is also a really major driver of climate change. This is the IPCC from a few years ago. They estimate that agriculture, forestry, and other land use makes up perhaps 24%, about a quarter of all global greenhouse gas emissions. So a really serious contributor. And what's more, this is likely to get a lot worse in the future. So my colleague Mike Clark led a paper looking at what would happen if we stopped all greenhouse gas emissions except from the global food system. And pretty terrifyingly, what they found is that by 2100, the global food system alone is probably going to push us past the 1.5 or the 2-degree climate change targets. So agriculture is a serious, serious environmental issue, both for biodiversity and for climate change. However, to state the sort of blindingly obvious, agriculture is also vital for human well-being. These are the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and you can see that many of these are underpinned by agriculture. Zero hunger and good health and well-being, most obviously. But number 12, responsible consumption. Number 1, no poverty. Many of these have got agriculture as their underpinning. Indeed, I like to say that I think agriculture is probably the single most important activity for human well-being, but it has the potential to be the single most environmentally destructive of human activities. So what I'm interested in is how we can kind of balance these two sides, how we can try and gain these incredible benefits from agriculture whilst minimizing these environmental concerns. And in particular, I do this by looking at land use. And I do this partly because it's land use change which is really driving those biodiversity declines and indeed greenhouse gas emissions. Also because how we use land is really fundamental to many of these sustainable development goals. But also because land use is likely, or land rather, is likely to be a key constraint on what we can do in the future with agriculture. So agriculture already occupies at least 40% of ice-free land, And as this map shows, a lot of what remains is either at the high latitudes, it's in these desert regions, or it's in one of these high biodiversity tropical regions that we really don't want to see agricultural expansion in. So that's why I work on what I work on. What am I actually going to talk about after that rather long introduction? Well, I'm going to see how we can try and balance biodiversity conservation with food production, starting off at a landscape scale and then looking at a global scale and looking at the possible efficacy of different responses. So at a landscape scale, what can we do? How can we minimize the harm of agriculture to biodiversity? Well, if this is the current situation, we've got a patch of natural habitat here with biodiversity represented by trees. And then here we've got a patch of farmland, which produces some food, that's the wheat here, and also has some biodiversity on the farmland. We've got some trees. Say we want to produce the same amount of food at the least cost to biodiversity. There are two different sort of directions we can travel in. Firstly, we can try and maximize the biodiversity value of our farmland. Now, we know from both empirical and theoretical work that this is likely to reduce our agricultural yields. This means that we're going to need a larger area to produce the same amount of food, and so we will lose natural habitats. But hopefully we can sort of share this agricultural land between food production and biodiversity conservation. And we term this, in fact, a land sharing approach. Conversely, we might say, actually, natural habitats are the really important things. We need to prioritize their conservation or maybe even their restoration. To do this, we want to produce that food from as small an area as possible. So we increase our agricultural yields as high as we can. This, again, is likely to come at a cost to on-farm biodiversity, but we use these high yields to spare land from conversion or for restoration. And we term this land sparing. Then between these two, there are literally an infinite number of alternative strategies that we can use. And it is important that we check all of these rather than just looking at the two extremes. So given that, how do we actually decide which of these is more or less damaging? Well, to do this, we actually need to go out and we need to count things. We need fieldwork, we need empirical data for this. And specifically, we need to know how individual populations respond to changes in agricultural yield. So here on the x-axis, we have the agricultural yield of a single patch of land. From 0, those are natural habitats, all the way up to whatever the maximum sustainable yield is. And on the y-axis, we have the population density of a single species within a single habitat patch. Now, some species are going to respond like this. As soon as you start producing food from a patch of land, that species population kind of crashes. For these, there's very little point in trying to conserve them within agricultural land. They simply can't survive there. Instead, we need to maximize our natural habitat conservation. We need something like a land sparing approach. Conversely, some species will respond more like this. They really don't mind low yield agriculture, and it's only at these really high yields that their populations collapse. You therefore want to avoid these high yields, and you want something more like a land sharing approach. Other species may increase with agriculture, or they may increase or decrease, or show any number of other responses. The point is we actually have to go out and measure things. We have to go out and see how individual species respond. And we've done that in a large number of places across the world. So I worked in Yucatan in Mexico for my PhD, but we've also looked at mixed agriculture in Poland. We've looked at agroforestry in Ghana. We've looked at livestock systems in Kazakhstan, a huge range of ecological and agricultural systems. But despite this variability, we've actually found a very clear and consistent result. And that is that land sparing is the least harmful strategy to most species. What this means is that most species simply cannot really survive in agricultural land. They need natural habitats. Over 60% of species do least badly with land sparing. And I think it's actually worth pointing out that I think this is a big underestimate. And this is because most of the species we've looked at are birds. And we know that birds are relatively resilient and resistant to changes in habitat. If you look at the trees that some of us looked at, for example, mine in Yucatan or in Poland or in Ghana, you see a much stronger result. 75, 80, 85% of tree species require a land sparing strategy. So what this tells us is that habitat loss is more important than subsequent agricultural intensification. This mechanism of loss, the really important one, is that initial habitat conversion. Okay, that was a landscape scale. We're going to come back to some of these ideas later. But what's going to happen at a global level? We know that biodiversity is declining now. What's going to happen in the future? Well, to understand this, we do actually need to dig into those indirect threats. If we look at this causal chain, we can't simply predict habitat loss into the future, because habitat loss doesn't happen for no reason, right? We need to understand the source and the driver of that change. And I guess the qualitative result is pretty obvious. It's that pressures from and on agriculture are just going to increase in the future. So these are UN population projections. We're looking to hit 10 or maybe 11 billion people by mid-century. And these people are almost certainly going to be consuming more. So as people get richer, and we hope that people will be getting richer in the future, they're going to consume more calories. And to begin with, at least, this is definitely a good thing. We're going to be lifting people out of food insecurity. We're going to ensure that people are better nourished. However, after a certain point, you can see that we've got really high levels of per capita food demand up here. Sorry, on this graph, we've got per capita GDP on the x-axis, per capita food demand on the y-axis. And as people get richer and richer, they consume more, and they also consume more of environmentally intensive products, particularly animal products. So it's likely that we're going to require a lot more from our agricultural land in the future. So what is the impact of this going to be on biodiversity? Well, myself and Mike Clark, who I mentioned earlier, set out to try and answer this with a sort of a crack team of collaborators from across the world. And we figured we needed to know a couple of key questions. Firstly, we needed to know how much land we're going to need, right? How much do we need to support this growing population and this increasingly consumptive population? Secondly, we need to know where this land is going to be. And preferably, we need to know that at really quite a fine spatial scale so that we can link it not only to changes in biodiversity, but also to potential policy responses. And once we've got this, we can then start to ask, okay, what are the likely impacts going to be on biodiversity? So what did we do? Well, we started off with a global equilibrium model called IMPACT. And this uses demographic and economic trends to project how much food every country in the world is going to produce in 5-year increments up to 2050. And notice that it's food production, not necessarily food consumption. So there is a global trade aspect to this model as well. This gives us, as I said, the amount of food that every country in the world is going to produce in 5-year blocks. We then need to know how much land we need to produce that food. To do that, we link demand to projections of agricultural yield at a country-by-country level based on historical changes in yields. That then gives us a land demand for each country in the world. Now we just need to decide where within a country that land is most likely to be found. And to do this, we didn't actually use an economic approach or a optimization approach. Instead, we actually built probabilistic models of where expansion or contraction is most likely. So we split up the world into a very fine spatial scale, 1.5 by 1.5 kilometers. And we used MODIS satellite data to look at where there were past changes in agricultural land, both pasture land and cropland. And then we modeled those changes based on a series of explanatory variables: agricultural suitability, the presence of existing agriculture, distance to markets, or actually travel time to markets, the presence of protected areas, and also past changes in agricultural land. And if you're interested in the kind of the nitty-gritty of the modeling, we actually did this in a two-step process. So first of all, we built a multinomial model to give us the relative probability of an increase, a decrease, or no change in agricultural land. And then we used GLMs to project how big predict how big a change we would see. And what this gives us is basically a probability map for every country in the world of how likely cells are to experience a change in agricultural land. What we can then do is we can use those probabilities to pick cells iteratively and convert agricultural land within them. And we keep on doing this until that 5-year land demand for a country is met. We then recalculate all those probabilities, because obviously those explanatory variables have changed, and we repeat it for the next 5 years. Then, because it's a probabilistic model, we repeat the whole thing 25 times to make sure that we're getting a consistent result. So what this looks like, this is Uganda in 2015. As we run the simulation forward, you can see agricultural land expanding out of where it currently is. These colors are spreading out, and also they're getting darker. So we're having intensification in existing agricultural land. Just to run through that again, you can see it expanding out and also intensifying. So we do that for every country in the world, and then we stitch all of those countries together. And what do we find? Well, this is agricultural land in 2010. Darker areas represent higher amounts of agriculture, and then we can overlay agricultural change on that as well. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we see big increases in the amount of agricultural land, particularly in these high biodiversity tropical regions, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, also in Central and South America and Southeast Asia. Also a surprisingly large amount in the US actually as well. We can talk about that later if you're interested. There are some places that show declines. So for example, across quite a lot of Central Asia and Eastern Europe, this is a combination of increasing agricultural yields combined with slowly increasing or even falling population levels. So that gives us agricultural land up to 2050. But what's the actual impact of that going to be on biodiversity? Well, to do this, we simply overlaid these agricultural projections on maps of suitable habitat, again at this fine spatial scale, for about 20,000 species of terrestrial vertebrates. That gives us a proportion of a species' range, which is likely to be converted into agricultural land. And we can use species-specific data on their survival in agricultural land to estimate changes in habitat availability. So for some species, they'll lose habitat as it's converted into cropland or pasture. For other species, they're probably not going to care. And what we found, again, this probably isn't a surprise, big losses of suitable habitat across much of the world. So here I'm showing you the mean change in habitat area for all of the species which are found in one of those 1.5 kilometer cells. And you can see there are big changes, 10 or 15% average losses of their global remaining habitat for species across sub-Saharan Africa in particular, but also South America. However, these mean losses actually conceal, I think, much more worrying patterns. So here we're looking at changes for individual species. And these are just the species which lose at least 25% of their available habitat. And you can see there are hundreds of them. In fact, almost 1,300 species we projected would lose at least a quarter of their available habitat. And a couple of things to sort of point out, hundreds of species, again, projected to lose at least 75% of their habitat. And these are going to be at serious risk of regional or global extinction. And remember, this is just from agricultural expansion. We've not got climate change, we've not got hunting, we've not got any of these other pressures in here. So really concerning biodiversity losses. The other thing that is kind of worrying me is that there's a lot of green on this graph. So incidentally, I'm sorry if you're red-green colorblind. We're using the IUCN's colors here, and they're not the best. A lot of green in these bars, and these are species which are currently ranked as least concern by the IUCN. And this is worrying because these species may not be the focus of current conservation action. But it looks like they're going to be in a lot of trouble over the next few decades. And what's nice about doing this on a species by species level, it allows us to really pick out the parts of the world where things could be really bad going forwards. So here I'm showing you the number of species in each of those 1.5 kilometer cells projected to lose at least a quarter of their habitat, their global habitat, that is. And again, really worrying things in sub-Saharan Africa, with literally hundreds of species in the Rift Valley here and in equatorial West Africa, hundreds of species in each of these cells projected to lose at least a quarter of their global habitat. So we could have serious issues for entire ecosystems in much of the world. Okay, so far, not great news. How can we respond to that? So that was that first question, what's going to happen to biodiversity? What is threatening it? What about this second question? How can we respond to these threats? Well, the first thing we might think about doing is responding to this direct threat, responding to this mechanism of change. And the thing is, we know how to do this, right? We've got protected areas. We can propose them, we can design them using strategic conservation planning or another tool. We can then implement them and we can test whether they work or not. I said we're pretty good at doing that now. And in many ways, protected areas have kind of been a great conservation success story. Obviously, they vary in how effective they are. There are a lot of socioeconomic, sociocultural issues with them, which we can obviously discuss. But in terms of implementing them, we have got a lot of protected areas now. I think we're pushing 16% of global terrestrial land is now protected in some way. However, I think there's a fundamental question that we haven't actually asked, and that is, can this great array of protected areas that we have, can they actually protect biodiversity? Can they safeguard biodiversity in the short and the long term? In particular, two sort of key questions. One, are the protected areas we have big enough to support viable populations? And two, do individual species have enough of these viable protected populations to ensure their long-term survival? Because if you just have one protected area, all we need is maybe a fire, a disease, or even just political changes leading to that protection being taken away. And suddenly you haven't got anything at all. You need a bit of resilience, you need a bit of redundancy in your protected area system. So myself and some colleagues have tried to estimate this. And we concentrated on terrestrial mammals just because we've got better data for them than for many other species. So what we did is, for each of about 3,800 mammals, I'll just illustrate this with this this species, a mountain anoa, it's an endangered bovid from Sulawesi. What we did is we took the IUCN range map. So this is where the species is potentially found. And then within that, we identified suitable habitat. We can then overlay protected areas from the World Database on Protected Areas on top of these habitat maps and kind of clip out the protected suitable habitat. Then, using species and location-specific data or data estimates of population densities, we can calculate the potential size of populations. And then, for each of these species, we can say how many of these populations are going to be viable over either a short or longer term. And two kind of headline results from this. Firstly, a lot of species, over 2,000 of the ones we looked at, have more than 10 viable protected populations, at least for short-term protection. Here we're looking at a 95% chance of surviving for 100 years. So this seems to be pretty good news. But we did look at 3,800 species. So this means that actually over 1,500 species have 10 or fewer viable protected populations. And these really could be at quite a lot of risk if we're relying on these protected areas for their long-term survival. And this is a particular issue because, like I said, this is a short-term target for population viability we're looking at here. For large-bodied, slowly reproducing species, this target of survival for 100 years, it can be something like 25 or 30 individuals, which really, there's not a lot of resilience there. If we take a longer term view, if we look at a 99% chance of surviving for 20 generations, the number of adequately protected species declines really quite significantly. Well over 2,000 species using this metric have 10 or fewer viable protected populations. And again, remember, this is just potentially protected, right? We don't actually know whether the populations are as big as we hope they are. This is just how much habitat there is available to support a population. And things get really worrying if you look at the IUCN classification of these species. So looking at the number of threatened species that are adequately protected or have 10 or more viable protected populations, very, very few of them do. Almost all species that we currently list as threatened have 10 or fewer of these viable protected populations. So I think we can't really rely on the current protected area network to safeguard mammalian diversity in the long term. And this is really quite worrying because a lot of these protected areas were probably put in place specifically for mammals. If we look at other species that we basically care less about, I think the pattern is likely to be even more worrying. Okay, again, still haven't got much good news here. How can we respond to this? Well, the obvious thing to do would be to just increase the number and the size of our protected areas, right? We know that they do work to reduce habitat loss, so let's just roll them out more ambitiously. This is at the heart of quite a few of the biodiversity goals, and it's also at the heart of things like E.O. Wilson's Half Earth proposal. However, I think some of these proposals haven't maybe looked at this full causal chain. They haven't totally grappled with why we're losing habitat. Because remember, we already use 40% of our ice-free land for agriculture. And things are going to get a lot more difficult in the future, right? We need a lot more land under business as usual to support our growing population. I just don't think it's feasible to vastly increase the number of protected areas unless we're also doing something to reduce this demand for agricultural land. So, okay, what can we do instead? Well, this is where I think this kind of causal chain becomes really quite important, because can we do anything about tackling these indirect threats to biodiversity rather than relying on just tackling the mechanism? What about the driver and the source of change? So to look at this, again, me and Mike Clark came up with a number of potential responses to these indirect threats. So to try and reduce consumption, we looked at shifting populations towards healthier diets, focusing on the Eat Lancet Commission, if you've come across that. We also looked at halving food waste across the world, even though food waste is caused by very different issues in different parts of the world. We just had a blanket halving of it. We then looked at how we can try and reduce demand for agricultural land. And we did this by modeling closing yield gaps. That's increasing yields much quicker so that we reduce the gap between the potential yield and the actual yield in a region. And then also we looked at using trade to divert agriculture from the most at-risk regions and displacing it to places where there was a lower biodiversity risk. And then we also combined all of these into the imaginatively named combined approach. And what we found is that these approaches really do seem to be able to reduce habitat loss. So this is the picture I've already showed you, the figure I've already showed you of business as usual habitat loss. If we replicate that with the combined approach, you can see that you almost eliminate habitat loss by 2050, at least from agricultural land use change. Now, our core analysis, we assumed that habitat did not grow back in abandoned agricultural land. We said that the timeframes we were looking at were kind of too short. There's the potential for using these this cropland for fiber production or energy production, bioenergy or something else. But if you allow habitat to regrow in abandoned agricultural land, you can actually see increases in habitat across much of the world by 2050. So we're not even actually protecting habitat in any way. We're just trying to reduce these indirect threats. And what I really like about this analysis is that we're not just testing a vague sort of sustainability scenario. We can actually pull apart these 4 different policy approaches and see what has the biggest impact in different parts of the world. So these are the 4 constituent scenarios that we looked at. And I'm just going to concentrate on these 2 left-hand ones, closing yield gaps and shifting to healthier diets. And just focus on North America and on sub-Saharan Africa. Now, if we shift to healthier diets, basically this doesn't really have an impact in sub-Saharan Africa. And this makes sense because a healthier diet is likely to involve, for many people, an increase in the number of calories they're consuming, and potentially even an increase in the consumption of animal products, right? We're trying to increase food security in sub-Saharan Africa. In contrast, in North America, and indeed in Europe, just so I'm not picking on you, we consume too many calories and we consume too many animal products. So shifting to a healthier diet is going to reduce our overall consumption, and particularly our consumption of energetically, environmentally demanding foodstuffs. So it has a really big impact. In contrast, closing yield gaps doesn't really do much in North America. The US is incredibly good at producing food. It's incredibly good at agriculture, and there's really not much of a yield gap to close there. In contrast, it has a massive impact in sub-Saharan Africa. Indeed, I'm kind of increasingly thinking that for global biodiversity and potentially climate change as well, we need to think very seriously about agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa. It's looking like one of the biggest things that we can do in order to reduce pressures on global biodiversity. So I think we really need to be thinking quite seriously about what it is that these countries need, or what it is that they need from us that we can help provide in order to raise agricultural yields in a sustainable manner and try and reduce that demand for new agricultural land. And I'm saying we need to see what those countries need. I do think this has to be led from these countries. There have been enough, well, too many, in fact, efforts of people kind of coming in from Europe and from North America and telling these places what they should be doing. I think it needs to be time to hear what they need and to help them to achieve those goals. Okay. Some quick conclusions, and then I will stop talking. Biodiversity is likely to decline further without action. In fact, I don't think it's likely to. It is definitely going to decline further. And responding to direct threats, I think it's unlikely to be sufficient, and we're unlikely to be able to do it to the kind of degree that we need. However, thinking about the whole causal chain of threats, and by understanding indirect threats, we can first of all predict where pressures are likely to develop in the future. And then by responding to these indirect threats, we might be able to proactively reduce pressures before they develop. And so I did say at the beginning, I thought I was going to try and kind of draw out some broader conclusions. And I think that this kind of heuristic of the different levels in the causal chain and the different levels in how we respond to these threats can be really useful to identify what the best leverage point for action is. And I've concentrated on these indirect threats, but for some things, responding to the mechanism of change, or even directly responding to the state of biodiversity, might be the most important thing to do. So in this piece with David, we looked at the South Asian vulture crisis, and the first thing that people needed to do once they realized how rapid the population declines were was to just respond to the state of biodiversity, just to get some vultures into captivity and ensure that there was a viable captive population. It was only after that that people started looking at the mechanism that was driving those declines, and then looking at the source of that mechanism and so forth. So, like I say, I've been concentrating on the indirect threats because I think we don't pay enough attention to them in conservation science. But I'm not saying that the mechanism of change and the state of biodiversity aren't important. They're absolutely vital. We don't have enough information about them. And sometimes they will be the best leverage point for action. Next, having identified the leverage point that you think is really, really important for whatever system you're looking at, we then need to actively think about how we can respond to it. And we need to work through this chain of proposing, designing, implementing, and testing responses. So I've talked a lot about increasing agricultural yields here, both at a landscape scale and at a global scale. That is just the first stage. That is just proposing a response. We need to design policies that can make it happen. And in particular, we need to design policies that explicitly link increases in agricultural yields to natural habitat conservation. There's a lot of economic work which suggests that you can't rely, at least on a local scale or a landscape scale, you cannot rely on passive, what I would call passive land sparing. So increasing agricultural yields may actually accelerate habitat conversion at a local level. So we need to explicitly link yield increases to natural habitat conservation. Ben Phelan a few years ago led this paper looking at a few different policies that we could maybe use to do this. What we need to do now is we need to actually design real policies and working with people who bluntly know what they're talking about in situ to design policies, to implement them, and then to test whether they're effective or not. And I think there's a huge amount more work that conservation needs to do in this space. And basically, it's going to involve us getting outside our comfort zone, talking to economists, talking to social scientists, talking to economists, talking to people who understand these indirect threats and how we can try and address them. Fantastic. I'm going to shut up there, and yeah, would be very happy to take any questions or have a more general chat. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, David, for a terrific talk. We will take questions now, and there are two ways to get questions to us. You can enter something in the Q&A box on your screen, or you can raise your hand. In either case, I will call on you and hope that you will both unmute and open up your video feed so we can have something a little bit more like a real in-person seminar. I know an old friend of the C-PREE program, Xenia Morin, has posed a number of questions. Xenia, would you be able to ask one of your questions that you think might be of greatest interest to our listeners, or for that matter, of greatest interest to you?
Yes.
Please go ahead, Xenia.
Okay, I'm taking my video. Hello, everyone. Happy day after Valentine's Day. David, thank you very much for that talk. You stimulated a lot of different interests for me. One of the questions I had about assumptions for demand of agricultural land is, did you take into account how degraded the soil was, or how fertile the soil was in the areas that you were looking at? In particular, in sub-Saharan Africa, you have a lot of land in the Sahel, and there's limited fertility in some of that land because of extended drought and other things. So I'm wondering how viable it is to look at that agricultural expansion without considering the soil fertility.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. We did, but working at a global level like this, I mean, we probably didn't do it well enough, bluntly. So what we did is we used the FAO's ranking of agricultural suitability of soils. So that was one of the key predictors in our model for where agriculture was more or less likely. What we didn't do is we didn't put a kind of a cap on. Actually, no, that's not true. We didn't allow agriculture to expand into regions that we really thought were completely unsuitable, but we didn't have a variable kind of cap on, I suppose, how yields within a country are going to vary, and that's a really, really important point, because particularly in those Sahelian countries, there is going to be a massive demand for agricultural land. And our sort of assumption was that fundamentally people are going to farm, even if it's absolutely borderline. If you really need food, then you're going to farm in some pretty bad conditions. So I think probably our estimates of where agricultural land is going to expand, if anything, they're probably going to be an underestimate, because like you say, a lot of droughts, a lot of water availability issues mean that you might only get 1 or 2 years of agriculture out of some of these patches, and then you're going to move on. So yeah, really, really good question. I think to kind of really dive into that sort of issue, we need to be working at a smaller spatial scale, really. You need to look at individual countries and talk to people there. So I said, this is something that we're now looking at. Basically go to a country with our projections and ask people who know what they're talking about, like, how wrong is this and why is it wrong? And then use the same methods that we've got to incorporate that kind of information. So if they say this whole chunk of the Sahel, it's not happening, where does that then push agricultural land, and what are the kind of the knock-on impacts of that? Yeah, very, very good point, and one that basically we didn't adequately address.
Thank you very much. For the next question, I would like to go to our colleague, Bob Cohane, who has a question related to trade. Bob.
Thank you. That was a great talk. My question is about your trade model, which you mentioned but didn't examine. What are the assumptions of it about what's viable, and what would the impact be? What would your map look like if one allowed the maximum amount of trade that you think is feasible?
Oof. So I'll be honest with you, we did not have any macroeconomists or trade economists on our team. So we used just what impact spits out there. So I think the kind of the broad-based assumptions are, I think it's probably a gravity trade model, right, combined with the relative profitability that is built into that global equilibrium model. In terms of, sorry, I appreciate that. That is an underwhelming answer. Basically, I don't know what goes into impact. In terms of what kind of changing those assumptions would do, I don't know enough about global trade. So on the one hand, you could imagine that completely free trade you'll know this way better than me. Completely free trade could lead to a big increase in production in less economically developed countries, right? Stuff is cheaper to produce there, and therefore you would see even greater land demand in the future than we project. One thing that we did look at is if we kind of fudge that trade model to say, actually, we're going to produce more food in the parts of the world where we're really good at producing food and it has a low impact on biodiversity. Interestingly, we found that didn't really do much. So we allowed high biodiversity countries to import an extra 25% of their food. And it basically didn't change the results at all, only kind of a little wibble around. So I'm slightly dubious as the extent to which trade is going to have a huge impact. But like I say, I'm well out of my depth on that one.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to turn to Alex Swanson. Alex, if you would pose your question, please.
Hi, I was really impressed by the figure you had about the projected mean habitat area under the different treatments. And I was particularly impressed by the projected effect of healthier diets in North America and the northern part of Latin America, because it seemed really substantial. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that, especially what you mean by healthier diets. Are we talking like vegan, like having the amount of meat? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. So this is based on, like I say, the Eat Lancet Commission. So last year they published what they call the global diet, which is, well, depending on where you are in the world, either a massive reduction in the amount of meat and dairy that you're eating, or in some parts of the world, actually a small increase. So it's fundamentally, it's based around whole wheat whole wheat carbohydrates, lots of fruits and nuts and vegetables, and much less meat and dairy than we consume in the West. And it's really that reduction in meat and dairy which is driving what you see in North America. So as I'm sure you know, basically eating animals is just incredibly environmentally inefficient, right? You might need to put in 10 or 20 kilos of food into a cow to get a kilo of cow out. And so your land demand is just absolutely massive there. So if you can reduce the amount of animal protein which people are consuming, you have this massive impact on overall land demand. So that's really what's driving it. It's that shift away from meat. But I should say it's not vegan, it's not vegetarian. It's just a reduction in mean meat consumption.
Thank you very much, Alex. I'd now like to turn to Chris Crawford, who has a question. Chris.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for this talk. It was very interesting. I'd love to hear more about the land that the models project will be abandoned. And I guess two questions. First is, do those lands produce a significant amount of food? Or is it sort of a negligible area in terms of food production? And number two, is that lost production, if it occurs, subsequently made up for in the expansion area?
Yeah, really good question. So start at the end, is it made up for in the expansion? Sort of yes and no. So because we're looking at a national level, the countries that see land abandonment, their overall food production goes down, right? And that comes out of a combination of that impacts global equilibrium model and our agricultural yields. So if those countries are able to produce the same amount of food, or the amount of food they need on a smaller area of land, because yields have kind of accelerated past increasing demand, that actually leads to a contraction of agricultural land. So that's where that abandonment comes from. So some of these countries may show a decline overall in the amount of food that they're producing due to population changes. Some of them may be producing as much or more food, but they can just do it on a smaller area of land because agricultural yields have kind of caught up or accelerated. When there is actually a decline in the amount of food that a country produces, that it kind of is being made up elsewhere, because you're seeing big increases in agriculture elsewhere, but it's not the same food, if that makes sense. So if a country is a decline in demand, that's just a decline in demand. There is going to be food production elsewhere, but that's coming from a different place. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's really interesting how you're able to do that at a country level. So yeah, but it sounds like the dominant response is that the countries are able to produce about the same amount or to satisfy their demands on a smaller footprint.
Yeah, exactly. So, and this goes back to the earlier question about exactly what's going on in that trade model, which, like I said, bluntly, I don't know enough about how global equilibrium models work. It could be that some countries are actually exporting more of their food production if the right combination of free trade and relative profitability coincide. But overall, what's happening is it's being able to produce the same food on a smaller area of land.
Okay, great. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'm afraid we've run out of time, and there are still questions yet to be asked and answered, but certainly people should be quite willing to email our speaker, David Williams, if they have further questions. And you can also check with Chuck Crosby in case there are any openings in his schedule for today. I want to say, David, that it has been a pleasure having you join us and present a seminar. I found it enlightening and highly informative. And I want to thank you and the participants and everyone. Take care. Be well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for having me. It's been great.